After that fateful night at Lancaster Hall, where an unknown kitchen assistant saved $1 million dinner, they built something rare. A dream called Verdant. But what happens when the very dream that brought two people together begins to consume them? This is part 2 of Sophia and Henry's story, where love no longer fights poverty, but faces something quieter and far more dangerous: success, silence, and choices that cannot be undone. Because sometimes, love doesn't die from betrayal. It dies from being forgotten inside a dream that used to belong to both of you. Before we begin the story, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. There was a time when Verdant was just a dream, a flicker of hope in a storm. A cramped kitchen, a broken fridge, two people who didn't fully trust each other yet, but somehow cooked side by side like they'd been doing it for years. That time was gone. Now, Verdant was the place. The kind of place where high-profile clients waited months for a table, where food critics whispered its name with the reverence usually reserved for temples or funerals, where the plates were immaculate, the lighting perfect, and the silence between bites a little too heavy. The early evening sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, washing the polished hardwood floors in gold. Every inch of the dining room gleamed, from the brushed steel fixtures to the hand-stitched leather seating. Even the air felt curated, carrying subtle notes of rosemary, oak-aged wine, and something else. Something colder. Success. Henry Lancaster stood near the far end of the bar, one hand wrapped around a short glass of neat bourbon he hadn't touched. The tailored lines of his suit hugged him like armor. His jaw was tight, his eyes distant, locked not on the restaurant itself, but on a printed proposal lying open on the bar. The top page read, "International Expansion Plan, Verdant Tokyo, Verdant Milan, Verdant Paris." And beneath that, Brand Creative Director, Sophia Hart. Her name typed in clean corporate font. No one had asked her permission. In the kitchen, just feet away, but somehow a world apart, Sophia was slicing into a fresh heirloom tomato. Not with flair, not with performance. Just quietly, precisely. Her apron was dusted with flour, her hair tied back in the same no-nonsense twist she wore when this was all nothing more than survival. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. She could feel him watching her. But not like before. Not like in the early days, when his gaze held curiosity, admiration, even awe. No, now it felt calculating, like a man looking at an asset, a piece of his brand. And that scared her more than anything. That night, they sat across from each other in his office, the one with the glass walls and the art books no one read. The room smelled faintly of cedar wood and something sterile, like ambition. Henry gestured to the file on the table, tapping it once with the edge of his finger. "We've been nominated for Michelin," he said. "Tokyo and Milan are ready to sign. This is the next logical step." Sophia didn't speak right away. Her gaze dropped to the folder, her name printed on the cover like a badge she never applied for. "Logical," she echoed softly. "Maybe. But is it still honest?" Henry tilted his head, just slightly, confused, defensive, tired. "We can't stay small forever, Sophia. You said you wanted to matter. This is how." She looked up at him, her face unreadable, but her eyes looked like someone staring at a place they once called home, and now couldn't recognize. "I wanted the food to matter," she said. "Not the name, not the press, not the branding decks." "You call this growth," she added, her voice quiet but sharp. "But to me, it feels like the slow death of something we said we'd protect." Henry didn't respond. Not at first. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, his watch catching the light like a warning. The silence between them stretched too long to be casual. It wasn't a fight, not yet. But it was a fracture, and both of them could feel it spreading. Outside, the city kept humming, horns in the distance, heels tapping down sidewalks, lives unfolding. Inside Verdant, the final diners lingered over their dessert wines, unaware that the two people who had once poured everything into this place were starting to drift toward two very different destinations. And somewhere between the Polish and the prestige, between the corporate proposals and the five-star reviews, the soul of Verdant, the thing they had bled for, began to flicker. Still there, but dimmer. The sound of Verdant had changed. It used to hum, softly, like a breathing thing. Pots clinking in rhythm, the low murmur of a team in sync, the occasional burst of laughter over a perfectly seared scallop. But now, everything moved with the cold precision of a well-oiled machine. The dishes still looked beautiful. The customers still smiled. But something vital, was slipping through the cracks. Henry had always been the forward motion, a man driven by momentum, vision, hunger. In the early days, that energy was a gift. It pushed them through late nights, broken ovens, empty dining rooms. But now, that same force had become relentless. Meetings stretched from early morning into the late hours. There were Zoom calls with Tokyo at dawn, dinners with investors at dusk. Everyone wanted a piece of him, and he gave it freely, to everyone but her. And Sophia? Sophia had always been the grounding force, quiet, observant, deeply present. She once thrived on every detail, the temperature of the vinaigrette, the exact angle of a lemon twist on a dessert plate, the look in a guest's eyes after the first bite. But now she couldn't remember the last time Henry had truly tasted anything she made. One Tuesday afternoon, she walked into the kitchen to find her team clustered around a sleek white binder labeled Verdant Global Identity, Phase 1. Inside were color swatches, logo redesigns, uniform updates, a full branding system. She flipped to the back and froze. There it was. Her name, Sophia Hart, Executive Culinary Director, printed on embossed paper like it had always been there. But no one had asked for her input. No one had told her it was happening. It was like being cast in a role she didn't audition for. She watched Henry from a distance that week. Not out of anger, but observation. He smiled more in meetings than he did in the kitchen. He quoted growth numbers but forgot the names of 2 new prep cooks. He walked through the line and praised the uniformity of plating, but didn't comment on the taste. There was a moment, late one evening, when she stood at the pass watching him through the kitchen window. He was on the dining floor, shaking hands with a man in a navy suit, laughing at something the other man said. He looked confident, in control. He looked like a stranger. The breaking point didn't come loudly. It never does in stories like this. It came quietly, in the form of a dish, a new duck confit Sophia had spent 3 weeks developing. She'd adjusted the aromatics 10 times, tested it on line cooks, rewritten the garnish twice. It was supposed to launch next week. She found out it had already been replaced. Henry had approved a different version, streamlined, cost-effective, easier for replication across future locations. She found out from a junior manager, not from him. That night, the kitchen emptied early. She stayed behind, standing alone in the soft light, hands resting on the edge of the marble counter. The confit sat untouched in front of her, growing cold. It smelled rich, perfect, forgotten. She didn't cry. She didn't break anything. She just stood still, listening to the sound of the refrigerator humming in the silence, the same way you might listen to someone breathing in the dark beside you, long after the conversation has ended. Henry entered minutes later. He looked tired. His shoulders were tense. tie loosened, voice low. "You're still here," he said. Sophia didn't turn around right away. "Apparently," she replied, her tone quiet, not bitter, just worn. He walked closer, sensing something wasn't right, but not knowing where to begin. "I saw the numbers from last night. That table by the window. They loved the halibut." Sophia turned slowly. Her face was calm, measured. "Do you even know what was on the halibut?" Henry hesitated, blinked. His silence answered her. "That's what I thought," she said gently. She picked up the cold confit and set it aside, as if clearing space for the truth. "You used to ask. You used to taste. Now I'm just the person who signs the bottom of the menu." Henry started to speak, but she cut him off, not sharply, but firmly. "You've turned what we created into something that's managed, streamlined, delegated. You made it efficient, but you took the soul out of it." She paused. "You took me out of it." There was no accusation in her voice. That would have been easier. It was the calm of someone who no longer needed to be right, only to be seen. Henry didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just stood there, realizing too late that the distance between them wasn't theoretical anymore. It was real. It had walls, and she was already on the other side. She left the kitchen that night without ceremony. Not a storm out. Not a declaration. Just a quiet retreat. And as the door swung closed behind her, the hum of the fridge returned. Soft, constant, indifferent. Have you ever poured everything into something you believed in, only to one day realize you were the only one still showing up with your whole heart? If Sophia's silence feels familiar, type the word visible in the comments. You are not alone. Out on the street, the city moved on. Lights blinked, traffic hummed, people rushed toward things that felt urgent but weren't always important. But inside Verdant, the restaurant they had built together, the air felt heavier, the lights a little dimmer, the silence no longer peaceful, but hollow. And somewhere in the kitchen, a plate of duck confit remained untouched. It was a Tuesday morning when Sophia saw him again, the kind of morning that felt half asleep. Sky overcast, the air still clinging to last night's rain. The farmer's market on the corner was just opening, its familiar rhythm comforting in a world that had become increasingly unfamiliar to her. She was reaching for a bundle of golden beets when she heard a voice. Low, familiar, wrapped in a memory she thought she'd sealed off years ago. "Still picking the ugly vegetables?" She turned, hand frozen mid-reach. And there he was. Liam. He stood with that same casual posture he always had. Shoulders relaxed, one hand in his coat pocket, the other holding a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He looked older now, less polished than the last time she saw him, but more grounded somehow. Time had softened the arrogance in his jawline, carved deeper thought into the lines around his mouth. But his eyes, those were the same. Dark, careful. Like he was always 2 thoughts ahead, still waiting for the right moment to say something that might change the room. Sophia didn't smile. She didn't scowl either. She simply nodded, as if the moment were just a detail in her morning, not a thread yanked from the past. "They taste better," she said finally. "Yeah," he said quietly. "You always said the ones with scars had the best stories." There was a long pause. The kind of pause that held more than awkwardness. It held history. He wasn't just an ex-boyfriend. He was the first person she'd ever trusted in a kitchen. They'd cooked together in cramped flats, shared ideas over wine-stained notebooks. And when the grant opportunity came up, it felt like fate until it wasn't. Because Liam left. For money, for recognition, for a faster path to somewhere bigger, And he didn't just leave her, he sold the project without telling her, took her recipes, her name, her heart. And yet, here he was, in a quiet corner of the city, talking about carrots. "I'm not here to reopen old wounds," Liam said gently, reading the silence in her eyes. "I wanted to ask you for something. Not for me. For them." Sophia raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Them?" "There's this community center in the South End," he continued. "Kids with autism and sensory challenges. They're starting a culinary program. Nothing fancy, just something real. They don't need a star chef. They need someone who remembers what food can do." He held out a folded brochure, colorful, creased, modest. "You were always the one who saw more in cooking than just flavor. You talked about food like it could heal something. I didn't get it back then, but I do now." Sophia took the brochure, slowly. She didn't look at him. She just stared down at the cheap paper and let the silence speak. "I'm not who I was back then," she said, almost to herself. "Good," Liam replied. "Neither am I." She went, not for him, but because something in her gut stirred when she looked at that child's drawing on the brochure cover, a lopsided plate of spaghetti with the word home scrawled underneath. And when she stepped into the center, it was nothing like Verdant. No steel countertops, no imported ingredients, just second-hand pots, plastic cutting boards, paper signs on the wall. But it smelled like garlic and tomato paste, and when she looked around, she saw kids, 8, 9, 10 years old, hesitating to touch raw dough, grimacing at the sliminess of a mushroom, or lighting up at the texture of grated cheese between their fingers. There was one boy, about 9, with headphones over his ears. He wouldn't speak, wouldn't make eye contact. But he stood at the back table, watching everything. Sophia didn't approach. She simply set down a tray of fresh herbs beside him, mint, rosemary, thyme, and stepped back. After a minute, he reached for the mint, crushed a leaf between his fingers, sniffed, and smiled. It was small, brief, but it cracked something open in her that she hadn't realized had closed. Later, as she was washing bowls in the tiny sink, another volunteer asked why she came. Sophia didn't answer immediately. She looked out the window, where the sun had finally broken through the clouds, and said softly, "If food ever stops being love, then maybe it's time to stop cooking." She froze the moment the words left her mouth, because they weren't new. They were hers, words she'd once whispered to Henry, back when everything between them still burned with purpose. Words she'd forgotten she believed in. Now, in this room that smelled like onions and crayons, those words returned like a bell ringing from a distant church tower. Familiar, faint, impossible to ignore. She left the center that day changed, not in the way Hollywood would show it. No music swelled, no tears fell. But something in her spine straightened. Something old had been remembered, and something missing had been felt again. Sometimes, the people who left us aren't meant to return. But sometimes, they come back just to hold up a mirror, not to ask forgiveness, but to remind us of the parts of ourselves we stopped looking at. Have you ever run into someone from your past, not to rekindle something, but to rediscover a piece of yourself? If this chapter resonated with you, type the word Pessy in the comments. I'd love to know your story. The lights inside the Lancaster Club were deliberately soft, golden, warm, flattering. The kind of lighting designed to smooth out lines and erase the fatigue of ambition. It was the kind of room where everything, even betrayal, could look beautiful if packaged correctly. This was Verdant's night, a private gala for key investors, media, and potential partners. Velvet invitations, imported wines, a guest list stacked with Michelin executives, venture capitalists, and luxury lifestyle curators who barely tasted the food, but always knew what mattered most: ownership, scalability, control. Henry stood at the center of it all, tall, practiced, charming in the way people who've been trusted with millions often are. His tuxedo was pressed to perfection. The cufflinks were subtle platinum. His hair styled in the way expensive men wear theirs. Like it wasn't trying too hard, but cost a lot to look that way. He moved from group to group with the ease of a man who had already won. The launch of verdant Tokyo was finalized. Milan and Paris were next. Investors toasted to a future that, for the first time, felt inevitable. No one in the room knew that a signature had already torn the heart out of what they were celebrating. Not yet. Across the ballroom, the double doors opened. There was no fanfare, no spotlight. She stepped in alone. Sophia. She wasn't dressed for the evening. No sequins, no red lipstick, just a black dress, clean, understated, as if chosen to blend in with the night itself. Her hair pulled back into a quiet knot. No earrings, no makeup that wanted attention. And still, she turned every head. Not because of what she wore, but because of the way she moved, like something sacred that had been locked away too long and now walked among the living, cold and clear and silent. The quartet played on, unbothered, the clinking of crystal, the low murmur of networking conversations, the rustle of formal wear. All continued as she crossed the floor. In her hands, she carried only one thing: a single porcelain plate. Covered. Henry saw her just as she reached him. His smile faltered for half a second, a blink, a breath, a moment. He hadn't expected her to come. And certainly not like this, but he didn't speak. Not yet. Sophia placed the plate down on the cocktail table between them. Calmly. With precision. The way you might place a folded flag into someone's hands at a funeral. Then she removed the cover. Duck confit. Crisp skin. Blood orange reduction. A perfect quenelle of puree. Every element balanced. Technically flawless. Structurally sound. Cold. Completely, unmistakably cold. The people around them paused, instinctively, as animals do when the temperature in the room changes without explanation. Henry glanced down at the plate, then back up to her. But Sophia... She didn't flinch. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said, her voice low, even, soft enough that only he could hear her. "Exactly what the photos will need. Exactly what the brand demands." Her tone wasn't sarcastic. There was no anger, just a strange, haunting clarity. "But it's dead, Henry. Beautiful and dead." He didn't speak. He couldn't. "Like Verdant," she continued. "From the moment you signed that contract behind my back, it stopped being ours." She stepped back. "You made it scalable," she said, "but not sacred." Her words were not a weapon. They were a mirror. And Henry, for all his poise, for all his power, was forced to look into it. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand answers, because some betrayals don't need to be screamed. Some goodbyes are stronger when they arrive quietly, with a single plate, and no appetite left. "I won't fight you," she said finally. "Because there's nothing left to fight for. You already sold the only thing that mattered." Then she turned. Not slowly. Not dramatically. Just deliberately. Like someone who had finally stopped begging to be heard. Her heels clicked softly on the marble floor as she walked away. Through the guests, through the noise, through the storm she never caused but would no longer stand in. And Henry stood there, frozen beside a plate of food he couldn't eat, listening to a room that now sounded far too loud. Have you ever been surrounded by people, and still felt like the only thing that mattered just walked away? If that moment landed in your gut, type the word quiet in the comments. Some departures echo forever, even if no one else hears them. Sophia didn't pack a suitcase. She didn't shout. She didn't leave a letter. She simply walked out of the building that night with her keys still in her coat pocket and her silence wrapped around her like armor. Henry never saw her leave, but when he walked into the kitchen the next morning, her station was already cleared. The towels folded. The knives wiped clean and placed gently, blade down, in the drawer. She didn't take the apron with her. It stayed behind, hanging on the hook, like a flag at half-mast. Across town, far from the polished world of investor galas and truffle-infused reductions, she found a different kind of space. It was a rundown shopfront that once sold flowers. Now, the only thing growing was dust and potential. The tile was cracked in 3 places. The ceiling fan wheezed like an old man trying to catch his breath, and the windows were fogged with age, reluctant to let the light in. But Sophia stood in the center of it, hands in her coat pockets, and breathed deeply, as if this air, unperfumed and imperfect, was somehow purer than anything she'd inhaled in months. She used her savings, painted the walls herself, rewired the stove with the help of a retired electrician who only asked for soup in return. There was no grand opening, no ribbon to cut, no press release. There was only a handwritten sign taped to the door. We cook here. We learn here. We listen. At first, only 3 students came. 2 boys, 1 girl, all different backgrounds, different stories, but the same eyes, guarded, wary, like life had already asked too much of them, too soon. They didn't care about Michelin stars. They didn't care about plating, branding, or fine imported butter. But when Sophia showed them how to crush garlic with the side of a knife, when she taught them how to toast cumin seeds until the scent filled the room, they leaned closer. They began to ask questions. They began to taste. To really taste. Back at Verdant, the rooms were still full. Reservations hadn't slowed. The decor hadn't dimmed. The wine list had grown longer. The photos on social media still got their likes. But inside the kitchen, something had shifted. Not dramatically, but steadily, like heat bleeding from a room with the window left open. The new head chef was competent, respectful, but there was no spark, no soul, just replication. The staff noticed it first. There were fewer jokes on the line, less rhythm in the movement between prep and service. Plates went out on time, but they didn't sing. They didn't speak. The critics noticed next. The reviews didn't condemn. They mourned. A place of impeccable craft that has forgotten what it came here to say. Each course reads like a beautiful sentence, grammatically correct, emotionally vacant. Verdant, once a heartbeat, now a performance. And then came the headline that stuck, "The soul has left the room." Henry sat alone in his office the night that review dropped. It was after midnight. The lights were low. The windows reflected only his own image, the man who had built something remarkable and now stared at it, unable to feel pride. He scrolled back through old photos. Opening night. The first dinner service where Sophia cooked every course herself. Her, laughing in the prep kitchen with flour on her cheek, sleeves rolled, hair falling from its tie. He paused on that one, then turned off his phone, and sat in silence. He hadn't called her, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how to say what needed to be said without breaking. And Henry Lancaster had never been taught how to break gracefully. Sophia didn't wait for an apology. She didn't check her phone for a message that never came. She was too busy watching a child with shaking hands finally hold a knife steady enough to slice a strawberry clean in half. That simple thing made her smile. At the end of a long Wednesday, she stood by the window of her little cooking classroom, watching dusk settle over the street. The city felt quieter from here, as if it too had grown tired of applause and was craving something softer. She sipped tea, closed her eyes, and for the first time in months, she didn't feel lost, just somewhere else. Henry, meanwhile, found himself walking past the old prep station again, still clean, still unused, the knives still exactly where she left them. He reached out once, just to touch the handle of her chef's knife, but stopped short, because even now it felt too personal, too hers. Some losses aren't loud. They don't come with slammed doors or broken plates. Some losses are just the absence of laughter in the place it used to live, the absence of someone's hand next to yours when you reach for the salt, the absence of warmth in a dish that still looks perfect. It had been weeks since they spoke. Time moved strangely after separation, fast in some ways, painfully slow in others. Verdant continued without Sophia, just as the sun rose and set whether she was in the kitchen or not. But there was something in the air now, something weightless and hollow, like a glass cabinet with nothing inside. Henry felt it every morning. In the silence after the espresso machine hissed, in the space beside him where her notes used to sit, in the look of his staff, professional, loyal, but no longer inspired, and in the food. That was the worst of it. He couldn't taste it anymore, not the way she had taught him to, with memory, with intention, with soul. It rained that morning, not a dramatic storm, just a slow, soaking rain, falling with the kind of patience that doesn't ask for attention. The city wore it like an old coat, heavy, familiar, indifferent. Henry stood at the curb outside the community kitchen for several minutes before going in. His hands were bare. His shoes were damp. He hadn't shaved. There was no chauffeur, no assistant, no brand behind him. He wasn't here as the founder of Verdant. He was here as a man who had made a mistake. The classroom was small, almost too small to carry everything Sophia had poured into it. There were drying aprons on a line near the window, a collection of thrifted mixing bowls stacked unevenly on open shelves, and a chalkboard that still bore the faint outline of the words, "Taste before you speak." The room was quiet now. The students were gone. The floor was still dotted with footprints from the day's lesson, and a half-wiped counter smelled faintly of cinnamon and lemon zest. Sophia was at the sink, her back turned, rinsing out a pan. She didn't flinch when the door creaked open. She didn't turn around. She simply said, without looking, "We're closed." Henry stood in the doorway, dripping. No tie, no coat, no plan. Just a man, rain in his hair, an envelope in his hand, and something broken in his chest he couldn't fix with language. Sophia turned. Her expression didn't shift. No anger, no relief, just stillness, like a pond that had stopped trying to reflect anything. Her eyes were tired, not from work, but from having to carry something alone that had once been shared. Henry stepped forward and held out the envelope. He didn't unwrap it, didn't explain it, just held it out, gently, like it might fall apart if touched too fast. "There are 2 papers inside," he said. His voice was steady, but not rehearsed. A man used to speaking for audiences, now trying to speak to just one woman who mattered more than any room he'd ever entered. "The first is our original menu," he said. "The one we sketched at that old cafe. Remember? On the napkin with the bad coffee. You said dessert should taste like grief. I didn't get it then. I do now." Sophia looked at the envelope, but didn't reach for it. "The second is the cancellation form. No franchise, no Tokyo, no Milan, just Verdant. Or nothing at all." He paused. "I signed it last night." The words didn't echo. They just hung in the air between them, like steam from a kettle, rising slowly, asking to be noticed. Sophia took the envelope in both hands. She didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, she studied him, this man she once stood beside in the heat of kitchens and the quiet of early mornings. He looked older now, not aged, but worn, the way trees look after storms. And finally she spoke, soft, controlled, but not cold. "Why now?" Henry swallowed. Because it took losing the thing that gave it meaning to realize it wasn't the restaurant I loved building. It was building it with you. There was no flourish, no poetic speech, just that one sentence, honest, unfinished, raw for a long time. Neither of them moved. Sophia's fingers curled lightly around the edge of the envelope. Her eyes flickered, just slightly, not because she was ready to forgive, but because something inside her recognized that he had, at last, come not to explain himself, but to surrender. Henry didn't wait for a response. He gave a small nod, respectful, without expectation, and turned to go. He didn't look back. Because real apologies don't ask for applause. They leave quietly, letting truth echo in their place. Sophia stood in the center of the room, listening to the door click shut. The rain still tapped softly on the windows. She set the envelope down and opened it slowly, like peeling back the first layer of something buried. Inside was the menu. The original one. Handwritten in pencil, smudged at the corners, her handwriting next to his. Little notes scribbled in the margins. A star next to the soup. A heart by the roast chicken. The words "bitter-sweet" underlined twice beside the dessert. She stared at it for a long time, then unfolded the second page, his signature. Below the words, "Cancellation of global licensing agreement, effective immediately, no promises, no deals, just a choice, a step toward something neither of them could name yet, but both remembered. Some apologies don't come with flowers. They come with action, with silence, with letting go of something big, to hold on to something true. Have you ever been given an apology not in words, but in what someone was willing to walk away from? If this moment moved something inside you, type the word "return" in the comments. Because sometimes the only way back is through surrender. 1 year later. No headlines, no press tours, no return to the spotlight. Just a quiet wooden door on a tree-lined street, nestled between brick buildings that had stood longer than most love stories. There was no neon sign, only a small brass plaque beside the entrance, engraved with a single word, Noor. It means light, not the blinding kind, but the kind that slips through kitchen windows at dusk, the kind that stays when everything else fades. They didn't advertise. Each evening, the restaurant opened its doors to just 10 guests. No online booking, no VIP list. If you wanted to dine there, you had to write a letter. By hand. Tell them why you wanted to come. What food meant to you. What memory still lived in the back of your tongue. Every week they read each letter together, over coffee or while folding napkins, and chose stories that felt like they needed to be cooked for. On this night, the last guest, an older woman in her 70s, had written about the soup her late husband made during long Chicago winters. She hadn't tasted it in over a decade. She left in tears, smiling. "You didn't just feed me," she whispered to Sophia at the door. "You reminded me I still know how to feel full." The dining room was quiet again. The candlelight had dimmed. The wine glasses had been washed. Only 2 people remained, side by side in the kitchen, Henry and Sophia. They moved without speaking, hands in sync, shoulders brushing gently. She chopped herbs. He peeled garlic. The sound of a jazz record crackled from the corner, soft and low, like memory on repeat. They didn't need to talk. Silence had become their comfort now, not empty, but full of what no longer needed to be said. Then Henry paused. He set his knife down, dried his hands on a linen towel, turned to her. "I used to dream of building an empire," he said quietly. "Now, I just want to come home at the end of the day and know you're still choosing to stay." Sophia looked at him, not with surprise, but with a softness that only time and truth can shape. Then she smiled, just slightly, and went back to chopping. But Henry wasn't done. From his pocket, he pulled a small velvet box, worn at the edges, simple, unassuming. He didn't get down on one knee, didn't cue music, didn't need to. He placed the box gently on the counter between them, next to the rosemary and the warm pan of olive oil. "I used to think a proposal had to be grand," he said. "A rooftop in Paris, a ring that blinds, cameras, fireworks." He exhaled. "But you're not loud magic, Sophia. You're the quiet kind, the kind that lasts." He opened the box. Inside, a single emerald set in gold, delicate, timeless, the same shade as her eyes on summer mornings. "I don't need the world to know. I just need you to know. Will you keep choosing me, like this, every day?" Sophia didn't cry. She didn't gasp. She didn't reach across the counter like in the movies. She just looked at him, really looked at him, and offered her hand. He slipped the ring onto her finger. She closed her hand around his. "Yes," she said simply. "If you keep looking at me the way you just did, I'll never leave." They didn't kiss. They just stood there, their hands still touching, the scent of garlic and thyme warm in the air. Outside the window, a small paper lantern swung gently in the night breeze. Its light didn't blaze. It flickered, soft, quiet, steady, but it was enough. Enough to warm the space where once there had only been silence. Enough to hold two people who had weathered the storm, and still chose to stay. Not everything grand is worth holding on to. Sometimes it's the quiet things, the unnoticed glances, the steady hands, the kitchens without names, that hold the last bit of light we need to find each other in the dark. Because real love doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to be warm enough to stay. What did this story stir in you? If you were Sophia, if you were Henry, would you have walked away or stayed? On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate their journey? If this story touched something deep inside you, even in a quiet, subtle way, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter. Because sometimes, the smallest stories carry the most light.